be talking a bit about forestry and conspecific attraction and how they affect habitat selection and use by Canada warblers. So conservation of avian species at risk requires that we understand what is important habitat for the species and which activities or land use types constitute for that species. And you can get these habitat associations in several ways, but I think it's important when we're talking about conservation strategies that we understand which land use types and land cover types are used relative to their availability in that particular landscape. It's important that we understand how much they're being used, so the intensity of use or the amount of time that the birds are spending there. And it's important that we understand the number of individuals that can be supported by that certain land cover type. So in addition to habitat cues, like vegetation that we normally associate with selection in birds, they also can sometimes use non-habitat cues, so things like conspecific cues when searching for and settling in an area. And these can sometimes affect their apparent relationships with vegetation. So my study species is the Canada warbler. It's a neotropical migratory songbird. They are currently listed as threatened in Canada federally due to long-term population declines of about 2 to 4% annually since the 1960s. And over 80% of their breeding population breeds in Canada's boreal forest. So it's really imperative that we understand across their breeding range in Canada what habitat they're using and what constitutes threats across this region. So the Canadian Federal Recovery Strategy lists habitat loss as the main driver of population declines of the species. They suggest that forestry might be a key threat to both breeding and wintering habitat, but we still don't really understand the magnitude of this effect across the breeding range, and it seems to vary quite a bit across the breeding range. So it's important to understand how it varies in different areas of the breeding range. So in the northwestern portion of the breeding range, over here in Alberta, they're typically associated with old growth stands. And so in this area, current harvest rotations of about 75 to 100 years are limiting regeneration of these old growth stands. So this could pose a problem for Canada warblers if these are the only types of forest that they're using. But we still don't really understand if that's the case. We don't know also why these post-harvest stands are being used. Jumped a little bit ahead there. So old growth stands is what they're typically associated with, but there have been a few detections in post-harvest stands in Alberta as well. So ones with a certain amount of regeneration, maybe 11 to 30 years after harvest, or also stands where forestry companies have left some residual stands remaining. But we don't know yet why these post-harvest stands are being used, how much they're being used throughout the breeding season, as most of these studies have been based on point counts alone, and we don't know what densities of individuals can be supported in these post-harvest stands. And to complicate matters further, Canada warblers tend to exhibit a clump distribution, so they can be locally abundant in some areas and absent from other areas of seemingly apparent or apparently similar vegetation. They also have a very short breeding season in Alberta, so they arrive late in the breeding season and they leave fairly early. They have very limited time to assess suitable breeding habitat. So this suggests that it might be important that they use conspecific cues when coming back from their long migration and trying to settle in an area. But we don't know the relative importance of these conspecific cues compared to vegetation cues, or how they might interact. So my objectives were to assess the effects of forestry and conspecific attraction on Canada warbler selection, use, and density. So I generated hypotheses based on what we know about Canada warblers so far in this region. These aren't mutually exclusive hypotheses, but just are meant to test relative importance of these different factors. So I hypothesized, due to the high densities found in this region in old growth stands, that land cover type and forest stand structure might be important drivers of selection, use, and abundance. So I predicted that selection and use would be lower in post-harvest stands than unharvested stands, and that abundance would be lower in areas with higher percents of post-harvest stands. I also predicted that selection, use, and abundance would be lower in more recently than older post-harvest stands. Because some Canada warblers have been detected in and near post-harvest stands, I hypothesized, and in addition to the fact that some territorial songbirds will use edges as territorial boundaries for singing and defense of those territories, I hypothesized that Canada warblers might use edges between post-harvest and unharvested stands as territory boundaries. So singing would be higher in these areas near edges, and therefore acoustic surveys using same detections would be higher near edges. Use within the home range, here in the middle, so sorry if I didn't point this out, but this is selection, use, and abundance. Use within the home range should be unaffected by edges, as it's accounting for both singing and non-singing locations. And then edge density should negatively affect abundance, as it would be a more fragmented area. Since Canada warblers seem to have this clump distribution, I hypothesized that conspecific cues might be driving their selection of certain areas. So I predicted that selection and abundance would be higher nearer to conspecifics, and again that within the home ranges, their use would be unaffected by conspecifics. And lastly, we know that local scale abundance can be affected by larger landscape factors. So I predicted that the amount of old growth in the surrounding forest matrix would positively affect their abundance in that area. So I'll just briefly go through our methods. Our study area was in Boreal, Alberta in Canada. So Alberta is pictured there. This is just north of Edmonton. We've got 3 study areas, so Lesser Slave Lake, Calling Lake, and Lac La Biche, kind of across the longitudinal breeding range in the province. We pre-selected these areas based on previously known Canada warbler occurrences in areas that were highly disturbed by forestry. And within each one of these study areas, we pre-selected 17-hectare survey blocks. These were selected along a gradient of amount harvested from 0 to 100%, from years since harvest, so from 0 to 30 years since the land had been harvested, and different configurations of the remaining stands of forest. And in each of these, we conducted point count surveys. So we walked along these 4 300-meter transects, and we conducted point counts at each of 100-meter intervals. So we got at second order selection, whether a male was detected or not at the point counts level. And then we counted the number of males found on the survey block for our abundance measure. We then selected a subset of individuals. That slide always gets laughed. These males were selected based on being near post-harvest stands. So males that were detected within 200 meters of post-harvest stands were selected. We color banded them, tracked them throughout the breeding season using burst sampling. And we delineated home ranges using minimum convex polygons and assessed levels of use within the home range. So then we used a geographic information system to extract our forestry covariates. So we used a cut block layer from the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute, and we extracted each of these triangles as representing a point count station. We extracted land cover type, so whether post-harvest or unharvested, the stand age or level of regeneration, the distance to the nearest edge, and the distance to the nearest occupied point from survey detections. For use, this is still in progress. So far we've used minimum convex polygons to delineate home range boundaries, and then we looked at the percent of post-harvest stands, shown in orange here, that was included within the home range. And our next steps are to use kernel density estimators to get a better idea of home range, core home range, and the level of use within the home range. For abundance, we looked at density of males on the survey block, as outlined in red. We looked at the percent of post-harvest stands, the edge density, stand age, and the amount of old growth in the surrounding forest matrix, which we just defined as a 1 kilometer buffer around the survey block. And then we also looked at the distance to the nearest occupied survey block, so the next survey block that had at least 1 male detected. So results so far, for our second order selection analysis, we used logistic regression. We test relative importance of stand type, stand age, and distance to edge, so just our forestry covariates. And we ranked these by AIC and found our top ranked model included land cover type and an interaction with distance to edge. So we see that our selection ratios were much higher for those points in unharvested stands than in post-harvest stands. So you can see here, of our 91 point counts where we had detections, we had much higher detections in unharvested than post-harvest stands. For those males where they were detected in post-harvest stands, selection ratios were really high, nearer to edges of unharvested stands. So they were more likely to be there if it was near the edge of an adjacent unharvested stand. As the distance to those unharvested stands increased, the selection ratios decreased. We then added conspecific proximity to see if this improved our model, and again ranked these using AIC. And indeed it did improve the model. So in addition to these forestry covariates, conspecific proximity was important, and selection ratio decreased with increasing distance to the nearest neighbor. For levels of use, again, this is still in progress. This is just some qualitative analysis. So out of those 55 males that we tracked that were near post-harvest stands, less than half of them used any post-harvest stands within their home range. Those males that did, which are those 24 shown in this graph here, over half of them used it in less than 20% of their home range, and only 5 of them used it in more than 50% of their home range. So they're only using small amounts. Those males that did use post-harvest stands tended to have significantly larger home range sizes than males that used unharvested stands. And for our last analysis for abundance, we used negative binomial regression to test relative importance of the amount post-harvest stands, the edge density, the age, and the amount of old growth in the forest matrix. And our top model just included the percent post-harvest stands, and this was included as a cubed term. So our abundance of males decreased steeply with increasing amount of post-harvest stands, and then decreased more gradually as we get from about 50 to 100% harvesting in the block, because at that point we only have about 1 or 2 males. Again, we added conspecific proximity, and this improved the model quite a bit. So not only the amount of post-harvest stands was important, but where the nearest occupied survey block was. And the abundance of males again decreased with increasing distance to those nearest neighbors. So just to summarize, we did find some support for our land cover type hypothesis and our conspecific attraction hypothesis. We found partial support for forest stand structure and edge. So we found that males were selecting areas in unharvested stands near conspecifics. When we did find them in post-harvest stands, they were near adjacent unharvested stands. They are at high densities when we had little to no harvesting, and decreased with increasing amounts of harvesting. And we found even those males that were detected on point counts near post-harvest stands didn't generally use a lot of it in their home ranges, and tended to have larger home range sizes than males purely using unharvested stands. So this suggests further that unharvested stands are important habitat in this part of their breeding range. Selection ratios and densities are higher in unharvested than post-harvest stands. It also suggests that conspecific attraction might have a role to play here. So males might use post-harvest stands to be near conspecifics that are in adjacent unharvested stands. So I've pictured this here. If the one area is saturated in the unharvested stands, some males might try to be near conspecifics, and in doing so are using those edges between post-harvest and unharvested stands. So conserving large amounts of unharvested stands where we know there's occupancy within this region might be an important conservation step. We do have some future work to do here still. We'll be looking at level of use within the home range, so how much they're actually using that post-harvest, not just how much is included within those territory boundaries. And we'll also be assessing breeding success of those males using post-harvest to see if there are any consequences for reproductive success. And with that, I'd like to just say thank you to everybody involved in the project, and thank you to all the funders, and thank you to you guys for listening.
Have you done any scientific experiments to understand the conspecific attraction better?
No, we haven't, and that's something that, I don't know if they're here right now, but there's some people studying Canada orbit down in the southern extent of the breeding range in the Appalachians. And they are looking at that. So that's not something we tested here, just because we were mainly looking at forestry and kind of looking at how maybe proximity of conspecifics might change that story. But yeah, that would definitely be a great way to get at that and not be worrying about the underlying unmeasured variables that might be contributing to that. Yeah.
Did you find any variation in the age?
And that's something we are going to be looking at. So far, I've just done kind of the large-scale abundance and selection stuff, so we didn't have age for all of those males that were just detected on point count surveys. We do have age for those males that we tracked, that we have the home ranges for, so that'll be definitely something to look into, because it might be the case that those males kind of on the outskirts are the younger males that are, using older males as a cue where to go and are kind of getting the short end of the stick there. Yeah. Yeah.
Did you, I forget, did you say how old the harvests are and whether they're all the same?
It's kind of along a gradient, so we did from 0, so harvested the year before, to 30 years previous. And we did test effects of forest stand age, and at the level of selection, it didn't come out in the top model, but the harvest age was positively associated with selection. So the older the forest got, they were more likely to select them. but they're still more likely to select unharvested than post-harvest, regardless of age.
But the degree to which they're using a harvested stand was heavily influenced by the age, I would think.
Yeah, so
Once
not
they get past like 5 or 6 years old, they're
Yeah.
probably using that.
exactly. So it wasn't in the top model, so edge came out as being more important than stand age. But age is definitely contributing probably to which post-harvest stands they would use, whereas maybe ones that are between 0 to 5 or 0 to 10 years, they just wouldn't use at all.
From other studies, do we know anything about nesting success or productivity between the two ages of stands, or post-harvest versus rebound?
Not in this region, but Yadlin, Reitzman, and his group has a lot of information on that. And I think that they found that there weren't any differences between, they had, again, larger home range sizes for males using the second growth forest, but didn't find any differences, I don't think, in breeding success. So maybe that large home range size might be kind of, compensating for that, yeah.